Hey guys, welcome back. I'm in the lab here at Mets, ready. This is now part 2 of my discussion with Zach, our 70.3 triathlete. If you haven't already, go and watch part 1 because there's a lot you can take out of that one about the basics, the foundational principles of how I really had Zach walk in the door here in the lab. We tested him, we got him in some basic training program. We took him for all the way through to a 50-minute PB in a 70.3. It's still amazing how we did that in 12 months. But go and watch that one first. Then jump into this one where we start to get a bit more refined. And there's a lot that we talk about. We go on a few tangents here, so stay with us. But there's a lot that we talk about in terms of race nutrition. That was a big thing in year 2 for working with Zach that we really identified as a key way of improving his performance, just that extra little bit and continuing to see some improvement. So that's largely what we discuss in this one. Keep an eye out. There's also a part 3 to wrap up the conversation around the first 3 years working together as a coach and athlete combination. Hopefully you got plenty out of this, but without any further ado, let's now jump into part 2 of my conversation with Zach, our 70.3 triathlete. All right, so then we look post that. In this time, like heading after that second 70.3 is when we started doing some other races as well, wasn't it? It's like we started to incorporate some Olympic distance. Or was that more so than the following season? You probably would have done one after Geelong that year, maybe? In like the March, maybe?
So I think I actually started racing the 2XU series.
Yep.
That... I don't know, what do we call it, year 1?
Yep.
So I started training with you coming out of summer.
Yep.
Sorry, I don't know, probably more going into winter.
Yep. 2020.
And then, so it was that next season that I started doing some of those 2XU races.
Yep. Yep. So we started increasing, like, when those started popping up, purely from the fact of, like...
Just racing, like I had a race.
I was going to say, like... Just
transition? What the hell's a transition?
Yeah.
What do you mean you have to put your shoes on?
Yeah.
What? Like...
Yeah. Because that was the other thing. Like we don't have transition splits here, but I remember
read them out.
Another
times, man.
Yeah, another simple fix. Like we talk about gastrointestinal upset being a simple fix, but just like
exactly what you spent
practicing
10 minutes in T2.
Yeah, like we're burning so much time just in transition because it was like the more you race and understand the racing process and like, all right, what are my routines in transition? Like, do I put my helmet on first, then my sunnies? Or what am I putting like left shoe on, right? Like those subtleties can just save you like a couple of seconds here or there. But when we talk about like a sprint or Olympic distance race, obviously that's critical. When we talk about 70.3, like yeah, if you're burning like 10 minutes into transition when you only really need to use 3, like that's such easy gain of time.
Yeah.
And it's just all this practicing. So going and just practicing racing more and getting a sense of like what does this triathlon racing process mean for different distances? Like, can we challenge ourselves in different ways? Can we just go like what does it mean to go all out for an hour really in like a sprint distance race, or what does it mean for an Olympic?
For me, it means pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, I was going to say that
it doesn't matter.
That was an interesting thing we identified. And we sort of looked at, and you sent me a critical power graph the other day actually, which is pretty funny.
Sorry,
or
a critical
a power curve, straight
line.
Yeah, a linear power curve. Basically, we sort of started to identify that, and I guess this is where then your triathlon has naturally just sort of focused more and more on long course triathlon, which is a critical point looking at those individual traits of. We started incorporating sprint and Olympic distance, and what we started to notice more and more, and we've learned over time, is that there's a very small gap in terms of pace for what you've got at sprint distance for what you have at 70.3, and potentially what we predict it may be full distance as well, but we haven't really gone fully into that path. Maybe at some point, we've discussed it a few times about full distance, but we'll worry about it for another day. But we sort of looked at like there's not much gap between what pace you were holding in those races. So we went like, what do we want to focus on here? Do we want to be more of a long course or a short course athlete? Because the demands change a little bit. And we sort of went, well, the fact that you're running kind of similarly in a 10K Olympic distance to a 5K versus almost what we're sort of getting at half marathon distance as well. Like there's not much changing here. Long course, definitely more you go. Having said that though, we started getting to a point where you're starting to do pretty well at those races. I'll let you introduce the stat that you gave me before off camera around what's your win-loss record at the Melbourne Olympic distance races that they've had in the last couple of years?
What I will say is that first
the first Olympic you did before the first 70.3.
Yeah, where I just turned up and I had nothing training.
You went and did one of those, so you didn't win that one.
Who knows where I came?
Yeah,
whatever it was.
Yeah.
I think I went like 2 hours and 25 minutes or 2.5 hours for like distance. I had no idea what I was doing, man. I don't even know how I finished. I was like, I hadn't trained.
Yeah, you did it.
Anyway, I did it.
Fast forward though, what's our win-loss of the last 6 races?
So then did some training, and then
That's
that first Olympic distance race for the year I turned up to, and I was looking around at the end of the race going, where is everyone?
There's not many people here. Yep.
But I guess anyone who was cluey and wanted to train properly probably had pissed off to a different state. So it was a really good combination of things for me, because it was a bit of a confidence booster, and maybe boosted the self-belief a little bit, because I was like, oh, okay, maybe I can do okay at this. But yeah, I don't know. I can't remember the last Olympic distance 2xu race that I've lost.
He's pretty humble about the stat. 6 from 6. So you raced we said before, you raced 7 Olympic distance races and you've gone 6 from 6 in the ones that you've actually trained for. The 7th one was that original one. This is obviously age group racing, so like we're not talking. We're talking about winning age group here, which like
I probably should have raced elite.
You probably should have raced. You probably should have raced like open or elite, but it's a type of thing that we sort of go. Realistically, you're still only like 3 or so years in. Like this would be your 4th racing season from a 70.3 perspective.
Oh, well, I don't know. Do we just chucking out that first one? I'm like,
if we look at Geelong 2020,
this is year 3.
This is year 3 in terms of a preparation cycle, but year 4 in terms of like you've actually gone out and done a race in that season. Yeah. So we're still very much like, I think it's like definitely still appropriate the racing age group, but like it's not exactly like you're in an easy age group. Like for all of this, you've been 25 to 29, you're now 30, 34. Like we're in competitive.
I'm balls, man.
Yeah, not really. You're only just in there, but you're in like arguably some of the most competitive male categories. And like the series down here in Melbourne's a quite competitive series at Olympic distance. Like, you get some solid athletes in there. Like Geelong's a very competitive race. Melbourne 70.3 is a very competitive race. So it's not like these are just going and sort of like they're local races. Not many people rock up. Like these races are pretty big events. Like we're sort of talking like 1,000+ athletes. Your age groups are always sort of the heaviest, like dominance of athletes in that sort of 25 to 35 or 40 sort of range. Most athletes are that category. So you come away with some pretty good wins. So I think that, like you said, that confidence booster of being able to go, you know, I can stack it up against some pretty solid amateur athletes here. Like I'm actually pretty suited to this sport and I can do well. I mean, it's a good stat to have. And like as much as we go, we haven't ever really focused on that distance. It's just a byproduct of you've got pretty good aerobic development over the last little while, and we've trained quite well for 70.3. It's translated most of the way. If you wanted to go and race Olympic distance, like we would have to change things drastically if that was going to be your focus. Like it obviously requires a different preparation, but it just goes to show like how much development we've sort of been able to go through by just building the fundamentals, having a long course focus, but it still translates elsewhere. Like you can still go and race these shorter ones and still be quite good. Particularly at the amateur level, it probably changes slightly when we talk about elite, but like that's a pretty handy stat to go from not really knowing what the sport of triathlon was and being involved in it to then going, well, your last 6 races, winning your age group, like pretty comfortably. All credit to the work you put in largely, of which that then sort of leads us into our last block of long course races. So do we want to go, if we just take a little bit of a step back, some of the testing you did at Monash, if we sort of just highlight who they are. So down the corner from us, Monash has a research testing facility. They focus on ultra endurance, like nutrition, bunch of great dietitians, some really smart guys working in there around like what's going on, how do we identify these issues, how do we prevent them. Fundamentally, it really came down to changing a bit of your diet leading into racing. Yep. Like, do you want to just quickly describe a bit of that? Because then we'll get into Geelong 2022. So beginning of this year, go back, we raced that same course for the 3rd year in a row. We obviously go a little bit quicker again, mainly because we changed some GI upset stuff. And that's largely from the data you got and the insights you got from doing some of that extensive testing with the dietitians there. So what were the key findings out of that? Why were we having gastrointestinal upset?
Okay, so there's
if you can break it down simply, because it is quite complex, but if we keep it simple, what were the main things?
Okay, so there's pre-race and then there's obviously in the race. So pre-race at a pretty simple level, I mean, you just want to keep your food as simple as possible.
Yep.
So specifically what they looked at and what I've found works no problem is 3 days, keep it low FODMAP,
Which is?
I'm not going to try and pick that acronym apart.
Yeah.
But
fermentable
carbohydrates.
I was going to say, in practice, what are the substitutions? Like, what's an example of a food that you're going to eliminate in that period, but a food that you might consider taking? Like,
so garlic is a great example of a FODMAP food.
So you're getting rid of that?
Yes.
Yep.
Yep. Just simple things. And then I guess so. FODMAPs, that's one, and then low. What do they call it? Not low fiber, but low. I can't think of what it's called.
Describe it then.
So that there won't be a whole bunch of stuff backing up in your GI system.
Yeah.
Low residue. Low residue, low FODMAP, low irritants.
Yep.
So, I mean, what does this look like? It means like...
give some like meal examples. Like
cutting out... Yeah. So, just keeping food super simple. But, subbing out, the normal bread that you're eating, wheat. Yep. Can be an irritant for some people, and the gluten can be an irritant for some people. So just subbing that out with a substitution. There's a load of brands out now that are all over this stuff, and it's so easy to do.
Yep.
But that's massive. 3 days before the race, focusing on that, going into a plan, knowing what you're going to eat. I actually order the meals.
Yep.
Like for 2 or 3 days before, like a big race, it's like an A race. Frozen meals, low FOD, low residue, and it's so easy. So that's the first part. So that's pre-race. You get into the race, you've got nothing in your stomach. You know that there's not going to be any sort of disasters happening. Then you've got during the race. So the big one for me was actually fueling appropriately, working out what fuel I could take on that wasn't going to cause a problem, and then making sure that at race intensity I could take in the fuel, and I actually had to train up my gut. There's a bit involved in that because obviously the longer you go or the further you get into a race, especially like start to talk about over 3 hours.
Yeah, that 3 to 3.5 hour mark. Like every time we go and have a discussion with Ricardo and the guys at Monash, so they talk about that being a critical mark, isn't it? It's like things change at that point.
This is where there's a lot more blood getting sent to other parts of your body that are working hard.
Yeah.
So if you haven't had stable blood flow to these areas for a long time, things can go really bad. Even the simple one of making sure that your stomach, things are actually passing from the stomach to the bowel. So I had to do a bit of work on that because it's interesting. We did a bit of stuff measuring hydrogen.
Yep.
Coming in here, just to actually see how much was passing through and how much was sitting. Super interesting. So being able to train that. So what are we talking about by training that? Sitting on the bike trainer with a stack of solid food in front of me.
Yeah, make it as difficult as you can, isn't it? It's like what's a hard way to get this fuel in to get us used to it.
Ricardo Flamin sends off those ultra boys with hot dogs with sauce and cheese on them. And
that sounds awful, but it's like
to train their gut.
Yeah, and I'm sure it works.
So for long rides, eating solid food, so that keeps the sphincter between the stomach and the bowel open.
Yep.
So once you got to train this stuff up. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, it takes a bit of work
because we're talking about a lot of stress on these vital organs.
Yeah.
So that was a massive part of it.
Yep.
Then there was working out, the right amount of carbohydrate to take in and getting the sources right. Yeah. And the mixture right.
Yep.
That was another massive one, and that just takes time, experimenting. And then there's you did it sitting, riding super easy at 200 watts for 4 hours.
How do we do it at race
How
intensity?
do you do it?
Yeah.
Balls to the wall with your eyeballs poking out.
Yeah.
Lactate out your ass. But not for me.
Your blood lactate is excessively low comparative to most. But yeah, it's exactly right. It's like it's this slow process over time of like we have to go and train this stuff. Like just like we go and we train to get physiologically better to be able to just turn the pedals on the bike or go and run. Like we have to train our body to be able to take on the appropriate amount of nutrition to come in.
For most people, like we talk about, train hard, I'm getting my bike power up, get my run speed up, get my swim up. it's like, okay, you're going to save 2 minutes, or you're going to save, I don't know, I went 3 minutes quicker, or 5 minutes. Dial in your nutrition for a 70.3, or for an Ironman.
Yeah.
Oh, I saved half an hour.
Yeah.
I didn't have to stop and use the toilet. Or I finished and I had energy all the way through the run. Yeah. Oh, because I was able to take in the carbs all day and it was the right... Just these things, they save so much time.
Yeah, because I think it's such a simple thing that people forget, isn't it? It's like, you go out, like you say, you go out, you train harder, but you don't train that aspect of getting the fuel in. And a lot of people just forget that at the end of the day, really simply, it's just a process of like, if I want to run this quick, I need this amount of energy, and if that energy is available, I can run this fast. If that energy is not available, I cannot run this fast. I have to slow down. So if you're not refueling, it's like it just doesn't work.
This is a bit of a side point, but
go for it.
You're going to love this.
This will be fun.
I know in that second year, I was coming in here, listen to these podcasts and stuff, and low carb, Nick. We need to, my fat max. And, fat oxidation.
I remember the discussions we had around some of this
stuff. You were just looking at me, banging your head, going, you're an idiot.
It's the classic, like from my side of the fence, I see this a lot, and I went through this a number of years ago in terms of like what we call the Dunning-Kruger effect of like you start to learn enough information that you think you know everything.
You know nothing.
And I reckon it was at that point where you're right. It's like you started jumping on some of the podcasts that like I was going and listening to, or like you're finding podcasts, you listen to stuff, you read some blog articles, and we're having this conversation about like, we just have to go in all and like fat. It's like you go speak to. I was like, I feel like sometimes I was just kind of like, go speak to Ricardo. He's the dietitian. And what does Ricardo say? You need carbs.
He said
carbs make the world go round. Like
I think I even gave the like super low carb stuff a go for a while.
Yep.
That was an interesting VO2 max test.
Yeah.
Went in there and basically, I think I never ever get to a plateau in a VO2 max test. It gets too hard. And
you just run out of the ability to produce the intensity. Yeah. That's always been.
But that one test where I'd just pretty much been keto for, I don't know, a little while.
Yeah.
I went in there and it was a plateau, and I was just looking at it going, holy crap, my whole top end is gone.
Yeah.
Carbohydrate oxidation was at like nothing.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, Ricardo, I got off the treadmill, and I think you and Ricardo just looked at each other, and Ricardo just said, and he's like, dude, what are you doing? Like, just go on it.
You need to eat. Yeah.
It's just interesting. I mean, this comes up.
Yeah.
I heard an awesome quote the other day on Empirical Cycling's podcast. The cell doesn't, those ATP, they're not marked. This one came from fat and this one came from carbohydrate. Like, we're just talking about aerobic energy, guys.
Very, very, very basic physiology here. We were actually chatting about this before because I was reading through some old textbook stuff, and you're spot on. It's like at the end of the day, how the bulk of our aerobic energy is generated as a result of molecules going through the Krebs cycle and then going through electron transport chain. Regardless of if they come from fats or carbs, protein can be there as well, but we scrap that because we're never really going to use it. Fats or carbs are our two primary fuel sources for energy from an exercise perspective. Both of those molecules, before they get into the major part of the process, Krebs and electron transport chain to give us the ATP and the energy we need, get broken down into the same molecule, acetyl-CoA. Same molecule. Like you said, it's not tagged, this amount of ATP came specifically from this carbohydrate molecule. It all ends up being the same thing. Like, yes, there's going to be some different byproducts and things that come out as a result of it, and there's some slight subtleties. But the bulk of the ATP that's generated aerobically, it all goes through the same pathway because it comes out from it gets into the same starting point for all the major stuff that then happens.
Yeah. And
so it's like as long as we understand that we can get energy in, it's like, well, where are our preferential fuel sources? Let's not cut one channel off. Let's not just go through the fat side. So we said this before, it's like you go through fat only, if that's all you had to use, you can get a lot of energy, but it takes you a lot longer. It requires a significantly greater amount of oxygen.
So much oxygen.
So you're just not as economical. You might be able to last longer because you've got more fat stored, but you're going to have to go at a much lower intensity because you can't sustain that higher oxygen consumption. Alternatively, on the other side, if you just go carb, we're going to run out of carb because we know there's a much more limited supply.
Yep.
Let's use both.
Yeah,
let's maximize the total picture because, like you said, it doesn't matter where it comes from fundamentally. It all ends up at the same point. But if we maximize both sources, that's where our ultimate endpoint's going to be.
That's really interesting you say that, because I feel like, so we're kind of talking about year 2 in terms of training here, where I was getting all these crazy ideas and stuff and kind of relaying it back to you. But what we've found, like, so I'm talking about year 3 is what I'm, like, this is now
year 3,
where we've found out, you know, those changes, they're 90% training and maybe 10% diet. If maybe 95% training, maybe 10% diet. And I guess, you know, what we've found is, you know, exactly what you said, the mix of the fuel sources, which is why, you know, testing in here, I guess, is so important, because, you know, knowing the lactate profile, knowing the fatigue profile, and knowing the metabolic profile, these are the things that are really, really powerful information. Yeah,
absolutely. And like the way we're looking at, like, if we even take that as an example, like the way we're looking and discussing the data that we're looking at now is very different to how we initially talked about it. Like I remember explaining stuff to you, like, very basically, like I explained to 80% of the recreational athletes who come in for the first time here initially. It's like, here's the definition of VO2 max. Like, what does this all actually mean? Here's some general ideas, like, oh, your heart rate increases with exercise intensity. Like, very basics. We're now looking at from that more integrated model of, it's like, all right, we're trying to find what are the limiting factors now? What are some of the things that are changing really well? And we're not just going, oh, well, VO2 max is up, so that's great. It's now, well, like, in some aspects, we're probably not really concerned with that, because we just want to be like, well, what's happening from a race specificity perspective? Where are our limiting factors? What are the components that we can change to minimize those limiting factors or exploit those limiting factors to get an adaptation? Like, the conversation's definitely shifted in a much more complex direction. We still obviously keep it quite simple, so we know where we're going with it.
Keep it simple.
But it's also this, like, it's been this transition of, like, the more you've learnt as well over that path, like, the easier it is for you to then comprehend how we're going about it.
Yeah.
Like, rather than me just sort of talking at you and you go, what is he on about? There's, like, all these terms. Like, even that little quick physiology discussion, like, if I threw that at you 3 years ago, you would have been like, what is he on about? Who is this crazy man? But, like, you sort of get it now, because you've sort of, we're not just doing the training. Along the way, you're sort of picking up what some of this stuff means, and you're feeling it and you're understanding it, testing, experimenting with stuff, and you're going, all right, that didn't really work, or this did work. Like, that then becomes a really powerful approach to then lead into some racing. So if we look at, just quickly, before we sort of get into, I guess, where we're at, like, now, sort of in this sort of year 3, we sort of look at the race season that was at the start of the year. Unfortunately, we're not racing this weekend at Melbourne, because someone forgot to put his race entry in.
But someone's a cooked unit.
But we're going to be, like, 2023 is going to be our next 70.3. But if we look at our results from 2022, so we said just before, like, initial race, we went 5:07 at Geelong. We went down to 4:19, had some GI upset. Our third crack at Geelong was a 4:11. No GI upset. Couple of things that changed. We're about sort of 35 seconds quicker on the swim, 29, pretty much a 29 flat, a 2:14 on the bike. So we saved about 4 minutes on the bike. And then we saved about 3 minutes on the run. Very quick summary of that race. I remember we sort of came away from that being a little bit disappointed.
I was absolutely devastated.
Obviously, the year before we had a 50-minute drop. So, like, we probably weren't expecting to see another 50 minutes, because that would have been a world record time potentially. So we weren't going to see that much change. But do you want to just explain why you probably came away from that being a bit disappointed? We had, pretty much from memory, no GI upset during that event.
Yeah.
But what was the disappointment? Like, why we come away from that going, we're 7 or 8 minutes quicker on the same course the following year? Like, why are we disappointed coming away from that comparatively?
Man, I remember being on that run, and I remember already, like, kind of planning out what we were going to change and what we were going to do different. Once again, though, I mean, we're talking about, at this point, I haven't actually, I'm 1.5 years.
It's your third 70.3.
1.5 years in? Yeah.
Yeah. You start, we were sort of, like, getting to the back end of, well, you've been training realistically. So at the beginning of this, you've been training realistically for 2 years of training.
Yeah.
Like, the end, like, where we are now, right as it is now, so November 2022 is sort of coming to the end of, like, the beginning of next year will be the end of 3 years of actually, like, structured training. So we're sort of, getting to, like, 2 years in.
But once again, like, I was so limited. Like, what's tire pressure? Wait, hang on. What do you mean? Tyres? Yeah. What? Hang on.
Yeah, hadn't done a lot with Bike Fit, had we? And like, I remember even that simple stuff we did. Remember the velodrome? We went down and did some testing on like which helmet was a better choice to wear, and like, it's like we hadn't even thought about some of that stuff at that point.
Yeah. Still just so many things, but I thought that I could. I just thought that I had potential to go a bit quicker.
Yeah.
But it didn't translate on race day, so I just remember being so disappointed.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember you being pretty flat after that. And like, I mean, looking at it at the time, I remember trying to be much more on the side of like, I reckon I was probably a bit flat too, but I was like trying to keep you pumped up because I knew we had Melbourne coming up, and it's like, let's not just bin this summer because we've had an ordinary race. And it's one of those things, like a lot of people sort of like watching and listening to this sort of go, why are you disappointed? You're like a 7 or 8 minute PB. But it's like when we're talking about that point, like I think part of it that comes into it, something that, I mean, you might want to quickly touch on here. I remember going into that. Was it going into that summer of racing that you sprayed 4 hours, 4:00 on the wall of the shed at home? Like you had in your mind leading into that, it's like why can't we get as close as possible to 4 hours, and can we break 4 hours this summer? I remember that being a bit of a goal.
Yeah.
And so we sort of look at the psychology of that feeding in. Again, maybe if we look at that sort of Dunning-Kruger philosophy of, are we getting to a point where physiologically we've improved so much so quickly that we think it's just going to keep maybe happening? We set some pretty high expectations for ourselves and we fell a bit short. So like from a disappointment perspective, like you can understand where that sort of comes from. As much as like from an external side of things, a lot of people would look at that and be like, why are you complaining or disappointed about going and doing a PB and being like one of the top age groupers on the course? Like internally for you, it's like we set our standards quite high and our expectation quite high and we didn't quite hit it. So yeah, we're going to be pretty frustrated and disappointed. But then I guess that sort of almost motivates you a little bit to then keep going, because it's like, yeah, we do want to hit 4 hours at some point and see a 3 at the end of our race. We want to be a 3 something in terms of 70.3, of which we got very close to Melbourne 2022. So obviously the race coming up like as we speak this weekend, so November, but beginning of the year, age group only race, like not long after Geelong, you then go into a 4 hour 3 minute, which again, we still came away from feeling like we got more in the tank. I remember from that. Much faster course comparatively, which obviously sort of helped. But even if we look at some of the improvement there, like 15 or 20 seconds quicker on the swim, so first time in the 28s for a swim, 2:06 bike course, which was... You're a top 3, weren't you? Amateur cyclist. I think from memory, you might have been second fastest amateur bike time on the course or something like that. It was quick.
All I remember is being so far behind coming out of the
stand. So that was the problem.
Like,
a couple of minutes down.
Get to your bike, Zach, and send it.
Yeah.
Just put your head down and bury yourself.
And then we finished off with a 1:23, which I know from a 1:23 run perspective, the first 10Ks you felt pretty good. Back 10Ks it was just like, I just don't have the legs today. Actually, interestingly enough, we'll jump back to Geelong. Yep.
So I finished Geelong super devastated, but just like so driven.
Yep. So like, I'm gonna get it done. Yeah.
I mean, like you mentioned it before. I think I was like, I think earlier that year I was like, I'm gonna set the bar so high and I'm gonna try and smash it. So I got out the spray paint, and in my little pain cave training den, I spray painted on the wall that I look at when I'm on the trainer, like sub 4. And I was just so devastated when I didn't even get close.
Yep.
All I wanted to do was train more and just work out what went wrong. So I actually came back to you and we sat down. You actually told me not to think about it, not to really jump to any conclusions for gave it a week or something. And then I think I came and saw you. And
take the emotion out of any decision making we're gonna do, because like it's really easy to get caught up in that. You have a bad performance and you're like, let's just bin everything we did because it didn't work. Like it's like some things we do need to revise and look at, and since Melbourne at the start of the year, like we've gone through a few iterations of changing some things and like making some changes, but we're at a point now where we need to really continue to think about changing things.